Next, I'd like to reintroduce Mike Botchan, the Dean for the Biological Sciences, the College of Letters and Sciences here at UC Berkeley, who also, was a thought leader on the symposium and helped co-organize, and really passionate about interdisciplinary communication between science and, the wider structures that we're all part of. So Mike, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Julia. So just to get straight into it, it's really an honor and some fun for me to introduce my friend and colleague, Harold Varmus, to you this morning. Harold, of course, needs little introduction to us here at Berkeley, as he's a towering figure, both in the world of basic science discovery and science administration. Harold is a true polymath with a passion for ideas, and hence, I think we, all of us on the organizing committee, feel that he's an ideal speaker to help us kick off this interdisciplinary science and policy-based discussion. Just a quick whirlwind tour of his many accomplishments, both as a scientist and as an administrator. In 1989, a few highlights. In 1989, when he was a professor at UCSF, along with Mike Bishop, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology for the discovery showing that cellular genes encoding regulatory proteins called oncogenes are captured by viruses and cause cancer. Harold has also served our country long and hard, first as director of the National Institutes of Health, and then as the director of the National Cancer Institute. And this is, I'm going to highlight this here because I think it focuses on some of the points that Janet Napolitano just raised about the need for a cabinet level a person in the executive branch. Harold served when President Obama rebooted the office called the Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, OPCAS for short. He was enlisted as the co-chair. And Harold is presently today a professor at New York's Cornell Weill School of Medicine. But I know that he's continuing to do behind the scenes work with the Biden administration, with the new OPCAS. And he's also helping New York City contemplate a pandemic preparedness institute. Despite the fact that he'll deny that he has creds in public health, he might open up that way. I think he's a little understated there. For example, last August, at the peak of the pandemic and the presidential election race, Harold had penned an op-ed piece in the New York Times with Rajiv Shah, the president of the Rockefeller Foundation, that had the following header: "It has come to this, ignore the CDC. The agency's new guidelines are wrong, so states have to step up their own to suppress the coronavirus." Okay, now that we have some of the pressure off of politicizing the CDC, some revisions to ignore the CDC are probably in his mind. But much of what he said in that piece and the advice are still front and center. And so today I'll stop soon, Harold, and give you the floor in a second. But I just want to introduce his talk and say that he's going to emphasize the possible roles of cities like New York City, where he now lives, in the public health domains. The title of his talk is "What Urban Centers Can Contribute to Pandemic Preparedness." Okay, Harold, it's all yours. Take it over. Harold, you're muted.
Let me start again. So thank you very much, Mike, for those comments, and my greetings to my friends on the West Coast. And thanks to Julia as well as Mike for the invitation to say a few things. I also want to commend Janet Napolitano for giving us a broad and authoritative review of the situation and the failures of response to COVID-19. That allows me a little more liberty to focus, as I'd like to do, more narrowly, as Mike has already indicated, on the question of why we should get urban centers more engaged in developing a better response to the next pandemic. Before I get to that point of this narrow focus, I need to set the stage a little bit. As Janet's already indicated, as we speak here, the current pandemic is clearly not over. Caseloads in India, in South America especially, but other places in the world as well, are unacceptably high. And we have many cases still here at home. I distinctly remember a day, March 3rd last year, when I was alarmed by the appearance of 100 cases in a single day in the US with several deaths. And now that is, if we got down to that level, we'd all be very happy. But it's also true that the pandemic is subsiding in many parts of the world. In some places, it's been at low levels for some time. We can thank the developers of vaccines, the many scientists who worked many years to develop the technologies that were deployed to make these vaccines so quickly. Compliance in large parts of the world with social practices that were very important in isolating the virus. And as a result of the improved state of the world in many parts of our globe, there is more attention being given to preparedness and to accounts of what happens. And indeed, this symposium that CEND has arranged is one of them. And for many years, there are going to be books and reports, informal, formal, commissioned, that relate personal accounts, familial, local, national, and global histories, just as after the 1981 flu pandemic, books like this have been written for over many years. I realize that you have to read this backwards, but I think you'll get this as The Great Influenza by John Barry, one of hundreds of books that have recounted what happened over 100 years ago. So we're not going to be devoid of information. Indeed, information is already appearing about what happened in the pandemic, not just wonderful orations like the one you just heard from Janet, but reports that have appeared as early as October in 2020 from the Council of Foreign Relations, which assembled a task force that issued a study entitled Improving Pandemic Preparedness, the result of a study chaired by Sylvia Matthews Burwell, who was a former HHS secretary, and a business leader, Francis Townsend, and many other distinguished people, including as a member of the task force, today's the speaker who preceded me, Janet Napolitano. That is shown here again in backward lettering. And that I recommend this report, early as it is, as a good summary of poor performance at all levels, as Janet has outlined, and also a failure of harmonized international action, with recognition of the relatively mild consequences of the pandemic in countries like South Korea that were better prepared, perhaps influenced by difficulties with MERS and about 15 years ago, where they acted decisively and sensibly to test, to trace, to quarantine their populations. This is not a place for me to review the flaws that occurred in management of this pandemic. You've heard a lot about them from Janet. They're now familiar, and they're going to become more so as we develop more reports and official COVID commissions, about which I'll say more in just a couple of moments. Also, I think it's not going to be quite so difficult to convince the public that more pandemics are inevitable, costly of lives and livelihoods, and that will help us to try to become a more prepared country and globe. But we need to keep in mind that we can't keep the current debacle we can't blame that on a lack of warnings. As the Council on Foreign Relations report lists, there were about 20 reports from a number of renowned institutions over the 20 years prior to this one, advocating for preparedness, and listing the many kinds of signs of the need for preparedness that we all have heard recounted so many times: SARS, MERS, Ebola, Zika, H1N1, and so forth. And the CFR report makes many recommendations that you've heard about from Janet, sound very familiar now. Many aspects of improved governance are needed, stronger financing among those countries. But In my view, such reports as about COVID-19 and the few at hand, the many to come, with their urgent recommendations are going to be ineffective unless the US and other countries are willing to make much more serious commitments to public health and sustained defenses against emerging and pandemic diseases. And if I were able to show another sheet, I would show some numbers that make that point very clearly based on some of the things that appeared in the Council on Foreign Relations report. That when you compare the defense budget with the $750 billion and rising numbers every year, with at least a substantial part of the global health security budget, $547 million, which was falling in largesse before COVID-19, and the cost of damages, which we now know to be already just in the US in trillions, the point is made pretty clear that we need much larger investments. And those recommendations cannot simply be rhetorical. They have to be stated in dollar amounts that people understand to persuade the US government to and the public that such investments are now needed. And I'll say more about that in just a moment. Now, today I'm going to be an advocate, as I mentioned, for a specific proposal to make a global network of urban centers as a centerpiece of at least early stage preparedness against future pandemics. And I do this in hopes of fostering attention on a concrete suggestion that might bring committed people in multiple population centers together to organize the kinds of preparedness that the future of our society and even the survival of our species may require. Now, to do this, we're going to deal with at least three elements of response that I think are important. First, there is an underlying perplexing question that's already been raised here, and that is, why can't we oppose the threat of disease by supporting the mechanisms that protect public health with the same sustained and determined initiatives of the sort that we use to deal with the threats of war, of terrorism, of cyber attacks when we support our military and intelligence agencies. The second and third elements are in the foreground of what I'm going to be saying today. First, I'm going to argue that we should make a proposal and get behind it for a global network of sites that deal with surveillance for pathogens and unexpected disease, and sites for carrying out experiments in pandemic management and cultural engagement, which are central elements in preparing ourselves against more and worse pandemics. And I'm going to present that proposal in the context of trying to explain the importance of urban centers, based in part on things that I'll describe that are happening in New York, and in part on the need for a network of such centers and for committed partners who are expert in some of the skills that are needed to make urban centers highly functional, even early in our efforts to reverse the general lassitude that we've shown after previous pandemics. I also need to begin by saying a few words about my credentials. I know Mike has tried to be very generous in saying that I'm an expert in all things, but the fact is that I was trained as an MD and partly as a literary scholar, worked for 20 years as a lab sciences med school faculty member, and then spent over 20 years leading various institutions in government and academia. Now I'm back in my lab working on cancer biology. I was once a retrovirologist, but I'm not really a virologist anymore, and I have had no role in contributing directly to any of our now available knowledge about SARS-CoV-2. And I admit that I have only indirect knowledge of public health through work I've done with government and through my knowledge about infectious disease and cancer, which are public health threats after all. But I also think it's important to have people like me who are better known for our conduct of basic science and our advocacy for it as for its significance for treatment, to make the case for prevention and for public health practices, because sometimes we as outsiders to the chorus of voices that are traditionally complaining about the lack of attention to public health, to make the case. Moreover, some of my activities during the semi-quarantine that's been imposed on us and the travel-free hiatus that's given us a lot of free time have helped prepare me for this somewhat atypical role in the conversation about national science. And as Mike has already mentioned, I've been involved in writing op-eds but also watching carefully and engaged in discussions and doing most of that as part of 3 groups that I'd like to tell you a little bit about, hoping you'll be interested in those. 2 of those groups were assembled very early in the pandemic in March of last year to discuss the response, just because as engaged people, we wanted colleagues to talk to about these things, even if the conversations were limited to Zoom conversations. And one was a group assembled, as you'll hear, much earlier for another purpose, but is now also thinking about preparedness. The first group I call the Decameron group. It was composed of 10 people, all distinguished for their roles in basic science or public health, who called ourselves the Decameron group in honor of the book written by Boccaccio during the 14th century, describing the stories told by 10 young people who escaped from Florence to spend time in the woods, far from the ravages of the plague, to amuse themselves for the few weeks it would take for the plague to disappear. And we've not been that lucky, but during these conversations, we focused heavily on the role of testing and tracing and in the formula of things that could have better controlled the pandemic. Wrote an article that appeared in the Atlantic magazine in May and was also the impetus for the editorial that Mike mentioned that appeared in the New York Times at the end of August. The second group was a group that Mike has also alluded to, namely a group that was assembled by John Holdren, who had been Barack Obama's science advisor and the head of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, who gathered about half of the original President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, who had worked during the Obama administration, to assemble in the absence of a really effective PCAST during the Trump administration to talk about the current pandemic and what could be done. We started meeting in March of 2020 and disassembled with the election of Joe Biden and at the end of 2020, and wrote several essays about important aspects of federal management during COVID-19, including some things you've been hearing about already this morning, about the strategic national stockpile, virological testing, contact tracing, data management, epidemiological modeling, and all of those essays, which I think are still very much worth reading, can be found at the address opcast, opcast.org. That's how it looks forward writing. Backward writing, maybe you can see it. And I urge you to have a look at some of those. I want to make special mention of one more report on the list, a report that says a few things about the inevitable COVID Commission. We assume that just as there were after other national crises, such as 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, that there will be a commission, a national commission that is assembled, hopefully in a bipartisan fashion, that in a way that gives the panel authority to make suggestions, indeed declarations that are listened to. And the essay that the OPCAST group wrote about the inevitable COVID Commission addresses and raises a number of questions that we will need more authoritative answers to than we've had thus far. What actually went wrong? How did the pandemic start? How do we prepare the country and the world for the next pandemics, and so forth? And the third group that I've worked with is a group called Life Sciences New York Advisory Council, which was assembled by Mayor de Blasio and the New York City Environmental Development Corporation in 2017 to enhance the biotech industry in the New York region. And over the last several months, our advisory group has become a sounding board for the city's efforts to provide facilities and finances for testing in something called the Pandemic Response Lab, for tracking, for sequencing, and so forth during the pandemic. And more recently, the Council for this Life Sciences New York Initiative has been encouraged to think about future pandemic preparedness by forming an initiative or an institute that would carry out many things in the city that would foster better practices and help to generate national resistance to the next pandemic. And I will be talking about some of those things in just a moment. So late last year, when the Economic Development Corporation in New York began to ask our advisory committee about how to prepare the city against future pandemics, we were asked a number of things. How should preparedness be approached by public or private sectors, through global, federal, state, or local governments, using everyone everywhere or subsets of sentinel players. And I have to say, I don't have firm views about all these things, but I am now firm about three things that I'd like to speak to more directly as I start to come towards the end of these remarks. First of the three things is the need for serious, sustained public health infrastructure. And that means many things. It's not simply a matter of providing more funds. It means developing stronger training programs in public health to build a larger workforce and one that's obviously more diverse. We need more and stronger schools of public health, which is going to require a heavy lift. But we've created a large collection of excellent medical schools in this country. We have many fewer public health schools that have the same level of competence in research, and we need to change that pretty dramatically. And then we need to inculcate a new attitude toward the prevention of disease, one that rivals or outweighs our affection for treatments and cures that we hear advocacy for all the time. And then we need, as Janet Napolitano had also recognized, big increases in long-term budgetary commitments to public health, not simply disease preparedness, but a more fundamental approach to health that emphasizes prevention. As I mentioned before, it's possible, in fact, essential to do that in line with thinking about defense budgets for military security and cybersecurity. And I would hope that all of this would be more easily justified to Congress and to the other institutions that are necessary to increase our support for public health in view of the trillions of dollars required to repair the economic damage that's been done during COVID-19. And finally, we need to develop the public health, the contingent of public health experts who are in full-time positions in national, international, and local organizations. Now, I'd like to think we can begin a journey towards such long-range objectives by, first of all, creating a global network of urban centers as sites to serve as sentinels for disease, especially for early stages of a pandemic, and as sophisticated experimentalists and practitioners in three critical areas of preparedness that were identified in the Council on Foreign Relations report. That is, preparations to prevent, preparations to detect, and preparations to respond to pandemic threats. Now, I want to say a few things about the rationale for developing such a network and why we should be focusing on urban centers. Why major cities? Well, they are gateways where many people are flowing in and out. They have money, they have expertise, they have crowds, and they have ethnic diversity. And they're ideal places to serve as sentinels for surveillance or to use as test beds for new methods that detect, prevent, communicate about and provide social and medical responses to infection. And this includes research to enhance the capacity of urban centers that serve as sites for surveillance. And in thinking about that, let's recognize that right now what we do in the surveillance domain is only partially effective. We could do a lot better. For example, there are new ways to detect the appearance of pathogenic microbes in sewage, on surfaces, in the air, and other places. And we need to perfect those remarkable technologies so that they're reliable and widely used. Secondly, we have developed methods for seeking rare organisms in large volumes, but we haven't yet developed reliable techniques for assaying thousands of such samples. And that can be done with the kinds of technologies that have been developed for basic research over the last several years, combining next generation sequencing with polymerase chain reactions and use of barcodes. And so far, those methodologies have not become reliable enough to use in the current pandemic. And the idea of using our transportation hubs as places to collect those thousands of samples and carry out some of these methods for detecting rare positives need to be improved. We have the opportunity, as we've outlined in some of our opcast essays, for developing better methods for tracing contacts, mainly through the use of digital devices. And that can be done without undue privacy violations. That too needs additional attention. We have an imperfect system for monitoring the rates of known and unknown diseases and sharing and better interpreting data about them. And that too has been studied through the work of the OPCAST group. And there are great opportunities there to enhance the way we perform such data analyses. Fifth possibility is to develop better models, mathematical models, informatics-based models for the spread of infectious disease. And we have an opportunity through the social science skills that exist throughout the world of developing improved communication tools that convey public health messages to many ethnicities. Now, as many of us have been thinking through these issues, I was invited in January by the New York Development Corporation and its hospital system and the Rockefeller Foundation to a workshop that was organized in New York City to think about what the city could be doing in preparedness for the next pandemics. And let me just tell you briefly what I said there, because I think it's relevant to the discussion today at your meeting. First, epidemics and pandemics are by definition national and global, so they ultimately will demand national and global plans, governance and response. Let me not deceive you by saying that we can solve all these problems at the level of urban centers, but outbreaks begin and they spread locally, and that happens most likely in places where there are a lot of people. So it's critical that defense against outbreaks also be planned and sustained locally, especially in urban centers that are often the best positioned and the best endowed to take leading roles. These localities have flexibility, they can act quickly, and they have special resources. Now, at the same time, we've got to acknowledge that there are many components of a pandemic response, important components that can be done almost anywhere, don't need to be concentrated in these centers. And those include the conduct of basic science, drug discovery by biotech and pharmaceutical firms or by academic centers, production of personal protection equipment, manufacturing of vaccines. These things can be done just about anywhere. But there are other aspects of pandemic control that do depend on attributes of a specific place. And of course, for a meeting held in New York, I naturally considered New York, the urban center with which I'm most familiar and now most loyal, and tried to point out to the audience that New York City has at least 5 highly relevant attributes. And the first of those is it's an international gateway and also a national gateway. it has exceptional ethnic diversity and the civic action groups to go with it, has remarkable academic strength, global connections, lots of money. Let me elaborate on all of these. First, the gateway. So New York City is arguably the most important gateway for our country, for foreign visitors, for returning travelers who live in the US, for immigrants. As a gateway, it should also be one of the major sites for disease surveillance, especially against pathogens, either old or new, monitoring new arrivals and testing its diverse communities for the appearance of pathogens using powerful new technologies of the kind that I tried to indicate a moment ago to survey everything that's available: air, food, sewage, other waste, undiagnosed patients, and so forth. Second, let me say something about its ethnic diversity. Now, New York has been the gateway for a country of immigrants for so long that it probably has the greatest ethnic diversity of any city in the world. And for that reason, it's among the best places for studying the social determinants of pandemic response that must be understood to promote the best practices and that are used in controlling outbreaks. I recently heard from a colleague of mine in Oslo who reports a study being done there among Somali communities to encourage the Somali citizens citizens in Norway who are of Somali extraction, who are now responding more favorably to public health measures called for by the Norwegian government and helping to keep the pandemic in Norway under reasonable control. The third aspect is academic strength. And of course, New York has many universities that are well known, Columbia and NYU and CUNY and many others, but it also has a lot of research institutes, now a growing number of biotechnology as well as pharmaceutical firms, schools of medicine and public health, traditionally strong public health department. And as a result, New York can quickly mobilize talent to combat any disease threat when called upon, and it can perform the work that is called for both after and between pandemics. One special characteristic of New York City, which is often overlooked, is its strength in computational sciences at the Courant Institute, the Flatiron Institute, which makes it a good fit for the need for better modeling of pandemics, for improved data management, both clinical and basic science, and for better assessment of control measures, including control measures like contact tracing. Another strength is the New York Genome Center, where I have to admit I'm a part-time employee, with its potential for sequencing the genomes of pathogens and for charting evolutionary patterns as now is emerging with as a critical need in our control of COVID-19. Fourth, a word about the global connections that exist in New York. Well, New York is a world capital, a center for communications and entertainment, but it's also the home for the United Nations. And as a result, the city is particularly well positioned to study how to communicate assessments of pandemic risk and the response to, and to make connections with people near and far. And a word about money. New York is a financial center. It has a future as an economic powerhouse, which is deeply linked to its public health. And we see that dramatically illustrated during the events of the current pandemic. The city is also a place with people and institutions of immense wealth and its potential to make disease preparedness a stable and persistent feature of our culture. So from all of these perspectives, the city needs to determine, with the help of many other experts, how to establish secure sources of support for the kinds of public health programs that are required for national, local, and global defenses against disease, especially those with pandemic potential. Now, of course, we can make similar cases, and I would encourage us to make them for many other urban areas in this country, for San Francisco and the Bay Area, most obviously today, for Boston, for the DC, Baltimore area, for Dallas, Houston, for LA, for Seattle, for Chicago, and for many other places. And we can make the same case for many places abroad. And indeed, I've had conversations with people about this in London and Paris, and with lots of discussion of how concentrated urban efforts to prepare for the next pandemic could be made in other places that are less affluent: Cairo, Johannesburg, Santiago, Sao Paulo, Bangkok, Mumbai, Shanghai, and so forth. Now, following the January workshop held by the Economic Development Corporation in New York, there has been an elaborated vision of how an institute or initiative in New York City for preparedness might operate. And many of those elements are now incorporated into a request for proposal that was just issued by the mayor last week with a due date of June 4th. So the trains are moving here. The URL is now easily available if you go to the website for the Economic Development Corporation of New York, which is now seeking partners to launch and operate what is called a pandemic response initiative, not so much bricks and mortars, but an institution that's dedicated to trying to prepare New York City for future pandemics and for other public health emergencies. The idea is to perform work that is important during a crisis, after a crisis, between crises, with emphasis on the kinds of technical innovations, appropriate applications of those innovations, engagement with communities, and the conduct of racial justice, as I've been elaborating during this talk. So the notion is not just to respond to a pandemic, but to prevent, prepare for, recover from, and develop tools for resilience to pandemics in the future. This effort is supported by a commitment from the mayor's office of a modest amount, $20 million, but that's a start. And the effort is directed toward making this kind of initiative work in a way that will illustrate the power of an urban center like New York to make progress, even in the absence of national and global plans, to get us off to a rousing start and thinking about what's going to happen in the future. The effort is also intended to attract other coalitions to pursue technical goals. For example, a group of institutions, public, academic, private, have recently announced a national imperative for genomic surveillance, which is already weighed in the White House, starting with a proposal that the US use its diagnostic and sequencing capacity to perform comprehensive genomic surveillance, attempting to achieve the capacity to sequence 5% of all positive samples in the US. And that is obviously an important goal at a time when we have the technology to make a better assessment of the appearance of viral variants in this country during this pandemic. So I see what is going on at the moment as an opportunity to start building national and international coalitions of cities and urban areas, even before national governments and international bodies, which move more slowly in general, can get back together to begin to establish principles of how we prepare for the next pandemic. I'd like to think that this meeting convened by the Center for Emerging Neglected Diseases could be one of the first steps in building that kind of national coalition of urban centers and even an international coalition. So I urge those of you who are listening today, who have the influence to seek out your counterparts in New York and London and other major cities, to begin to discuss the creation of such a global network of defense, one that begins on relatively modest amounts of money that cities provide for creating the tools that they would use to contribute to the pandemic responses of the future, and one that inspires the necessary national commitments to public health and to public health institutions that will be required for sustained responses in the future. But thanks very much for listening, and I'll be happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk, Harold, and really inspiring comments. Mike, you had a question?
Yeah, well, Harold, first, thanks for joining us, and I wanted to continue the discussion maybe get Janet Napolitano involved as well. And the question I have is, given the importance of a White House group that advises the president on pandemic responses of the future, and this threats may be, as you pointed out, Harold, it may be a threat to the human race at a scale similar to climate change. Shouldn't there be a cabinet level person who represents the scientific community and technology community, joining with Homeland Security to actually lobby Congress? And, you know, a related question, of course, is how much is really going to be required to build this global network that you described? I mean, you know, I've heard that Biden is thinking about $1.6 billion for 6 centers for excellence in public health and pandemic preparedness. But
that's a drop in the bucket.
It's really a drop in the bucket. So the question is, how can we elevate this?
Well, let me say a few things about
cabinet level position. And yeah, go ahead.
So first of all, I strongly agree with Janet Napolitano about the need for one central person to be overseeing this whole effort, and that should be in the White House. I make my case for the urban centers as a starting point because we could do that today. I mean, it's clear that New York is doing it today, and that is going to take a longer time. There's going to have to be a commission on COVID-19, one that will take a year to marshal its recommendations. The congressional process is slow. I do think that inevitably, within the course of the next few years, we can change, especially with the support of Joe Biden, we can change the structure of the governmental apparatus, at least in the executive branch that oversees pandemic responsiveness and other public health matters. I think we've seen an important sign with the nomination of Eric Lander to be not only the head of OSTP, but also a member of the cabinet. And very importantly, as Janet's comments suggest, a member of the National Security Council. That's often overlooked in talks about the cabinet because the NSC actually meets and does things in a much more effective way than the cabinet. So I think there's a sense of urgency. There are sensible voices. There is a person listening in the White House that is responsive to the practice of science and the Council of Science. I think there is a potential for doing something along the lines you suggest, but I do think that we're going to have to think about federal dollars supporting this effort in the long run at a much higher level than 1 or 2 billion per year. There's going to have to be a flow of money that comes in other ways, and orchestrating, accounting for that money that will come from philanthropic organizations, from cities, from states will be important. As Janet was indicating in her remarks, part of the failure in this pandemic was not simply the fact that workforces were depleted and budgets had gone down, but that there was very poor coordination and there was no real national leadership to make the efforts that were possible as efficient as they could have been.
Janet, your thoughts on what sort of how to bring this up to the level of climate change and working with Congress?
Well, I think it's got to come from multiple directions. So, and I'm really intrigued by Harold's Sentinel Cities approach. I hadn't thought about it in that way. But in terms of how the federal government is organized, first you need a president who's going to take it on. And I think we do have one now. And I think, one of the things that we should be urging, and I made this point in my remarks, is that pandemic preparedness occupy the same level of urgency and importance as security preparedness does within the federal system, and that it be approached in that fashion. And this requires not only to have kind of a lead scientist in the White House, and I gather Eric Lander is the nominee of choice for that, but that individual will need to interact with the secretaries of defense, of DHS, of HHS, of state, and that interaction appropriately takes place in the National Security Council, which, as Harold mentioned, is a more appropriate venue for this kind of work than the cabinet writ large. And I think we just need to keep carrying that message, that is the appropriate place for preparedness to land.
I have another question around this. I think it's very compelling, this idea of learning from what we can do for defense and national security, applying that to pandemic preparedness. The thing that strikes me there is that if you look at the military system, for example, I mean, everything is organized with catastrophe in mind, that very, you know, they're highly effective in doing what they're doing. If I look at the scientific organization, is very different. We have a lot of people who have in charge of certain rules. It's a little bit, particularly around testing, it's regulated from different agencies. Sometimes nobody knows who's really in charge. So how do you see also, you know, not only from the top, but also the implementation pathway has to change somehow, the operational aspect? How can we introduce management practices that translate to action on the ground level where it's really needed?
I think it's possible to envision a way that you have an agency, perhaps one that's situated within an existing department, that you know, perhaps not unlike what BARDA could be, that has the tools, the rules, the money, and the organizational principles for implementation. I think we need to be careful about confusing what we know a lot about and can be done through good manufacturing and distribution processes with the kinds of research that's being done to deal with problems that we haven't solved yet, like best ways to model pandemics. I was part of the precast that tried to model the influenza N1 H1N1 pandemic, and we had a variety of potential outcomes, and we got pilloried because, of course, the press focused on the worst outcome, and we didn't have the worst outcome, and everybody thought modeling stinks. But you know, the fact is that that's modeling is hard; it's a work in progress, and you want to distinguish that from what is a secure set of operations that really can help and you know, ensure that we do have a national stockpile, and we do have research platforms that would allow us to make PCR-based testing of the kind that we labored to get developed in this pandemic. We have an assortment of scientific methods, but for some things we don't have the kind of military-like precision in putting things together. I think that is something that could be dealt with in a very effective manner if we just had the right executive alliance of the correct parts. And that was where, as Janet's remarks well illustrated, and other reports have too, where the country fell down way behind other countries in the early parts of the pandemic.
Harold, I think going all the way back to the local idea, I think something for people in CEND to focus on is getting together with the group in New York City that de Blasio has funded and that you're deeply embedded in yourself. And what would be some good ways for us to build on that thought? What do we do?
Well, I've already discussed some of these possibilities with people at the Economic Development Corporation, and I don't want to mislead you. I'm not in any sense running these programs, but I am enough in touch with these folks, and they do depend on me for certain kinds of connections. We've tried to open up some conversations with people in London who are also interested. I think the Bay Area is a really good place to do this because of its close connections with Asia and with the strength of academic institutions and the formidable research and both private and public sectors that exist there. Its multi-ethnicity and other features of the environs. So I think that some kind of, if I were going to select a second city to get going with New York, it would be San Francisco and the Bay Area. But there are other centers in the country that would also be very useful to collaborate with, even if it's just to develop ideas and develop methods that could be shared and discussed. And having one international partner, my obvious choice would be London, maybe Johannesburg or someplace else in South Africa, Mumbai when it recovers.
Harold, can you help me better understand the scope of the charge to the group in New York City, and who participates, and do they report to the mayor? I'm just a little bit unclear.
Yeah, right now, I could definitely, I will send to Julia and to Mike the actual formal request for proposals. And the idea is for, they're seeking an organization to run this effort, called an institute, called an initiative. There would be a reporting line to the Economic Development Corporation. The amount of money being made available at this point is still, in my view, rather meager, $20 million. What the relationship would be to the New York City or the New York State governments is still, in my view, a little unclear. They're asking for a proposal that has a vision statement about how it would be embedded within the state architecture. So I think some of these things are still up for discussion. And again, shared practices in other cities would be a useful way to think about this. Unfortunately, New York has a tradition of state-city rivalry that isn't helpful in trying to develop these kinds of programs, because the state should be deeply involved here, as well as the adjacent states.
And is it envisioned that the city will also relate to the federal system somehow?
Nothing is really said about that, and that's my view. That you can just begin this kind of thing quite quickly at a more local level. But if there isn't a clear way for the federal, state, and city governments to interact, as there certainly wasn't during the first part of this pandemic, then many of the things we would gain by establishing this necklace of urban centers will be lost, because it seems to me it's building up from the grassroots, from the urban centers, connecting them through their states, and building a federal network that in which a greatly enhanced CDC. I didn't address the CDC's status, but as you mentioned, Janet, there's a lot to be done there. Part of it's been solved just by appointing a wonderful new director, but there's a lot to be done to make up for the deficiencies in budgets and the loss of, as you know, the workforce, the people employed have declined just in mere numbers, and a lot of people have left, and that is unforgivable at this time in our nation's history.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you. One interesting question from the chat I want to relay, as long as I still have you both on, about general risk aversion in institutions, because particularly in testing and also some other areas, we've seen that there's things we need to do that are necessary, for patient health, clearly necessary for avoiding deaths, like reporting results to people. But we in this quagmire where it's kind of a legal gray zone, or it's not fully okay how we report, for example, testing results. I mean, we've been in the same boat with diagnostic testing where, you know, it's not allowed to just to text or email people their results because of HIPAA rules. So the question is, why don't we see more institutions, you know, kind of stepping into that gray zone more comfortably and just doing what's needed versus following the rules to the letter, that then ultimately lead to, you know, preventable deaths?
Well, that's a complex question and difficult to answer. And my own major employer never did any testing of routine testing, and I found that regrettable, if not appalling. So leaving institutions to do what they want to do is not always the best thing to do. Other colleges were making good use of private institutions like the Broad Institute that was providing tests for my alma mater and many other colleges on a very reliable basis and allowing education to proceed. I know if we have a crazy quilt of practices that were conducted during this pandemic. And I think the best thing we can do now is to try to evaluate what was done in that scattershot fashion and see what really worked. But I think the formulation that you just read out is a little hard to interpret, because there are advantages to having government oversight if that oversight is intelligently conducted.
All right. With that, any more comments, or should we move on? Thank you so much for your time. It's been really illuminating, and I love to see also the grassroots effort, you know, in New York. I think ultimately that's what has to happen much more, is for scientists to take charge and model some elements of what needs to happen on a larger scale so that it can be adopted.
I would caution you, just let's not say that scientists are taking over. I think people who are informed, respectful of science, informed by science, but you know, we need people who are in the social sciences and the humanities and in government, people who know how things work and how to make, maybe we need a military person running the public health efforts, at least in the short term, until we get the workforce of public health, people who are experienced in public health up to the level it should be.
And also what Janet mentioned, integration with local authorities and state people, because it seems it's so different, some things on the state level. And we particularly reminded me of an issue we've seen around testing, where, you know, we don't have enough capacity, for example, to train clinical laboratory scientists in the Bay Area. We used to have 3 schools that provide that training. In the last 10 years, 2 of them shut down, so there's only 1 school left. And now we were barely able to set up a facility here, even with the modified rules of just 1 CLS needing to be there to provide supervision, because we only had 2 on campus and 1 had to be brought in from retirement. And luckily, you know, she was able to do it, but without that, there would have been no path.
The workforce issue was important, but even more appalling to me was the failure of our society to understand that there are 2 kinds of testing. One is diagnostic testing, one is surveillance or an effort to screen to find out the frequency of positivity and virus positivity in our population. And that undermined a lot of the efforts that were made to do testing, to interpret it, to use the results of tests as effective tools in public health planning.
Right. And we have a workshop coming up tomorrow if anyone wants to participate, around developing regulatory crisis standard of care to particularly address issues like that. And the division of surveillance versus clinical diagnostic testing is one of the elements we were thinking about also.
Good.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Harold. Thank you, Janet.